Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining this ARRT webinar. I am Callie Koleski, Strategic Communications and Marketing Coordinator at ARRT. We're going to pause for a little bit, up to 30 seconds, to make sure all attendees are in the webinar. We will then begin with introductory remarks from Lisa Bartenhagen, President of ARRT's Board of Trustees. Lisa, I will prompt you when the room is full. All right, looks like we have a full room. Lisa, I would like to welcome you to the webinar.
Good morning. Thank you, Callie. As she mentioned, my name is Lisa Bartenhagen. I'm Program Director for the Radiation Therapy Program at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and serve as the President of the ARRT this year. So I'm very privileged to be able to hold that role. This is probably our third webinar that we are hosting to program directors, and we really appreciate all that you have been doing during this challenging times. I know it's been hard on programs, students, and RTs across the country. So we will get an update on the ARRT's pandemic actions. However, most of this time is going to be for you to focus on answering your questions. So before I turn the microphone over to Jerry Reed, our Executive Director of the ARRT, I'll turn it back to Callie, who's just going to give you a few more instructions for the program today. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Lisa. We will be using the Q&A function during today's webinar. On the bottom of your computer or mobile screen, you should see a button to bring up the Q&A window. We will ask you to type questions into the window after the presentation is complete. As we hope to answer several questions right away, please pay careful attention to these questions that have already been asked. Because you can click the thumbs up to vote for a specific question, I will present the most popular questions to our panel, so voting will go further than repeating an existing question. This session is also being recorded, so please don't worry if you miss a part of an answer. We will make the recording available after the webinar. With that said, I will turn the microphone over to Jerry Reed.
Thank you, Callie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start by introducing the other members of the ARRT staff who will be participating as panelists. Kevin Rush is our Senior Director of Credentialing Operations. JJ Powell is our Director of Education Requirements. And Terry Vatterott is our Initial Certification Supervisor. Next slide, please. So obviously, all of us have been through lots of changes in the 8 weeks since the World Health Organization declared a pandemic back on March 11th. We've had to adapt to many changes in our personal and professional lives. That's certainly true of the ARRT. Since the ARRT office is based in Minnesota, for 6 of those last 8 weeks, we've been under a stay-at-home order issued by the Minnesota governor. We still have another week to go in that order, and when the order was initially issued, it was for 2 weeks. It's been extended, so certainly it's possible that we may have more than just 1 more week to go through on the stay-at-home. Well, we certainly didn't know March 27th when the first stay-at-home order went into effect for Minnesota that we would still be under that order, but we have managed to adapt and keep things moving. It has caused us to make significant modifications in how we operate. Just a few of those examples. We did stabilize our operations by executing our pre-existing pandemic plan so that we could maintain essential operations. We got that underway quite quickly. And the plan was helpful, but didn't fully anticipate how long and how severe the conditions would be, how disruptive it would be to our operations. So as each extension of the stay-at-home was issued, we did make adaptations, including getting legal opinion that ARRT did provide an essential service that could have some limited on-site operations during the stay-at-home order. We transitioned our 100 staff members from our normal work from the office model to work from home. And more recently, after we received the legal opinion that we could have some exceptions, we introduced a modified work from home where about half of our 100 staff members are working entirely from home, and the other half are working partly from home and partly from the office for those tasks that can really only be done on site. We brought our call centers up to a high capacity under the work from home model. Of course, a lot of the calls come into our initial certification and continuing registration departments, and they have been functioning for the last few weeks. When Pearson VUE closed its test centers to all candidates except for EMTs and nurses, we did successfully advocate for radiographers, nuclear medicine technologists, radiation therapists, and sonographers to have access to the Pearson VUE test centers as essential professionals. And we are testing candidates at this point, but at a lower capacity than normal. We'll touch base on that in a minute. Those are just a few of the examples. One other would include resuming processing candidate applications, and we are working to clear the backlog that accumulated when we first were transitioning to the governor's orders for stay at home. And we are making progress. We'll touch base on that a little bit later as well. The examples really provide context to where ARRT is in adapting to the ever-changing conditions. And although I wish that I could say that we've developed a solution for the challenges that you and your students are facing in meeting ARRT's eligibility requirements, we're not there yet. I'll share with you during my presentation what we've been doing and the approach we've been taking, looking for possible solutions. And I say solutions plural because there may not be a single approach that will work for all educational programs and all students. I'll also mention some of the constraints that may not be obvious that we're working under in coming up with modifications. So in addition to sharing with you some of the criteria for possible solutions, we do want this webinar to serve as a call for action in seeking your help to identify and vet possible solutions to the challenges that you're finding, not just for the immediate conditions that we find ourselves under, but for the next period of time during which we probably will not be under normal conditions, and you will continue to face challenges that we would like to find a way to address. Next slide, please. So early on, the board set several goals for any solutions, any modifications that we took to find solutions. We didn't want to take any shortcuts that would undermine the value of ARRT's credentials, particularly those issued in the spring and summer of 2020. And we wanted to take the long view. We wanted to make sure the first goal was to preserve the long-term integrity of the RTR ARRT credential, as well as all of our other credentials. We wanted to support realistic access to obtaining and maintaining the credential. We obviously didn't want to propose solutions that simply didn't solve the problems that you and others are facing during these times. And third, we wanted to adapt to the current conditions while keeping goals 1 and 2 in mind, preserving the long-term integrity and making sure that any solutions proposed were realistic. Next slide, please. Some of the constraints that we were under or still are under are various stakeholders that we have for our credentials, certainly employers, certainly licensing states that are very interested if we are making any changes to our eligibility requirements. One that may not be quite as obvious is NCCA accreditation. ARRT credentialing programs are accredited. It's basically a seal of approval, kind of the parallel of your program's accreditation. Our credentialing programs have standards we need to meet to get that seal of approval or NCCA accreditation. And the accreditation is based upon eligibility requirements that we presented when we applied for accreditation. Any changes to those eligibility requirements need to go through a review to see if they still meet standards. So the approach that the board determined was to consider temporary modifications to requirements, not waivers. We did have received requests to waive the exam, for example, from candidates. That is obviously not something we could do without having significant negative impact on the integrity of the credential. We are only focusing on those students who are right at the end of their scheduled program. Their scheduled graduation or completion date is on the very near horizon. Obviously, solutions may need to change over time as conditions change. So we won't waive any requirements, but we will look for other alternative ways of perhaps meeting the intent of the requirements. And that's the approach that the board has set for the criteria for any possible solutions. Next slide, please. So as you all know, we have 3 categories of standards for obtaining a credential. They fall into the education category and the ethics category and the examination category. We know that the education standards are of greatest interest to you, but in looking at possible modifications, we have looked at all 3 types of standards, and we'll briefly address those here. Next slide, please. So of the 3 standards, there are ways to document that they've been met. The ways to document are really what we call our requirements, our eligibility requirements. So the degree in didactic plus clinical competencies are really what the education standards are about. We, of course, require a minimum of an associate degree. We have a document called the Didactic and Clinical Competency Requirements, which specify that didactically all students must complete an educational program that uses a curriculum that covers all of the content areas in ARRT's content specifications. And also, we designate a list of clinical procedures that students must document competency in order to meet our educational standards. The second bullet, code and rules of ethics. Under our ethics standards, we do have a code of ethics, which is aspirational, but more importantly, we have rules of ethics, which are enforceable. Under the examination, we, of course, have our certification examination that you're all familiar with. Those are our 3 E's, our education, ethics, and examination standards. Now, overlying each of those requirements are deadlines. For example, we do have a deadline that once an individual is declared to have met the education and ethics eligibility requirements, they have a 3-year time frame within which to finish the examination successfully, pass the examination. One of the very first actions that the board took was to look at our various deadlines and authorize extensions to those deadlines based upon the pandemic. That was one of the very first actions the board took in terms of 90-day extensions being authorized where they were required. Next slide, please. When the board started looking at potential modifications that met the criteria that had been set for possible solutions, deadlines was the first one. That has already been addressed by the board. The second possible approach was sequencing our eligibility requirements. As you know, currently an individual must meet all educational requirements before they sit for the examination. That's not always been the case historically. There was a time when an individual could sit for the examination even before they had completed all educational requirements. We would hold their test result until they had completed the educational requirements, and after we received verification that they had completed all educational requirements, we would then release the score. One of the approaches that the board's talked about is there a way to address the current challenges by resequencing our requirements? All of these approaches that I will describe have not been put into place yet. There are possibilities being discussed. As of today, all of ARRT's requirements are the same as they have been prior to the pandemic. So I want to be clear that the possibilities the board has been talking about are not ones that have been implemented at this point. The final bullet, satisfying the intent through alternative documentation of the requirements, is really receiving the lion's share of our focus. Are there ways that the requirements can be met in ways other than what we have required, what we did require prior to the pandemic and still require at this point? So of those approaches, the deadlines, as I said, those have already been implemented in terms of extensions where needed. The sequencing is a possibility that we're still looking at. And alternatives to satisfying the intent of the requirements, the best example of that is, can you simulate more clinical competencies than we currently allow to be simulated? As you're all aware of our didactic and clinical competency requirements document, we do allow some procedures to be simulated, but we have limits on the number of procedures that can be simulated. We also have very strict criteria for how a simulation must be conducted in order to meet ARRT's requirements. Next slide, please. So where are we at in considering possible modifications? For ethics, again, we talked about the code, we talked about the rules. There are no changes anticipated to the ethics requirements. Our ethics requirements department is up and running, processing potential violations of the rules of ethics. So no changes should be expected for the ethics requirements. Next slide, please. In thinking about the examination, there's kind of three parts, three characteristics of our examination. There's the structure itself, what we cover and how long it is. I know there are some other credentialing organizations that looked at possible changes to the structure of their examination. ARRT does not anticipate making any changes to the content or length of its examinations. Second component or characteristic is the pass-fail point, how many questions you have to answer correctly to pass. We do not anticipate any changes to the existing pass-fail point. The standard will remain as is. And the third characteristic is how the examination is administered. There has been talk among credentialing organizations, because of the limitations of test center, physical test centers, to moving to online administration of examinations. In fact, ARRT does offer remote proctored internet administration of its structured self-assessment for the CQR program. The SSA, or structured self-assessment, is a low stakes assessment, and that's why we allow that to be administered with online proctored model. We have no plans to offer the credentialing exam online. It will remain as a standardized administration at test centers. and I'll explain a little bit why we are not considering a change in administration on our next slide. And we can pull the next slide up, please. Well, one of the conditions for the credentialing program that has changed quite frequently is the test center. Prior to the pandemic, we were going at full testing capacity through PEARSON VUE, which is our test administration vendor. As the pandemic was declared, they went to a social distancing model, about 50% capacity. They fairly quickly then went to zero testing capacity as various states issued restrictions on gatherings of individuals. That zero testing capacity short phase was followed by selective testing, in which only EMTs and nurses had access to the test center. ARRT quickly advocated for radiographers, nuclear medicine technologists, radiation therapists, and sonographers to have access as an essential profession. And that was recognized by PEARSON VUE, and we began to, we resumed testing of candidates in those disciplines. It is reduced beyond the social distancing in that the only test centers that are available are ones in which PEARSON VUE staff volunteer to continue keeping them open. They are also at social distancing still. So in addition to the 50% from social distancing, decrease in capacity, there are test centers around the country, around the world actually, that are not open, so it further reduces the capacity. Well, that's created a backlog. We know when PEARSON VUE transitions back to the social distancing model, they'll still be at reduced capacity. Eventually, they will go back to full testing capacity. We are not able to predict that. They are not able to predict that. It obviously changes with conditions. But even when they get back to full testing capacity or something approaching that, there'll be a backlog. We have a backlog, and we do have some access. There are other professions that have no access to the PEARSON VUE centers at this point. How are they going to catch up with the backlog? How are we going to catch up with the backlog? The current plan for PEARSON VUE is to run test centers throughout the summer when they get back to that point of 24/7. So the test centers will be open, as many of the test centers as they can staff with that model. They'll be open all day long, all week long, until we get caught back up. So we do have capacity. We are testing individuals. We are keeping up with the scoring of those individuals and getting results out. So there is no plan to make a drastic change to test administration procedures. Next slide, please. Well, as we said, we know that education is really your keenest interest, I'm sure, the eligibility requirements related to education. The requirements are the degree, associate degree minimum. There are no plans for ARRT to make modifications to the degree requirement. Second is the didactic competencies, which again, that students complete a program that follows a nationally based curriculum that covers all of the areas within ARRT's content specifications. We do not anticipate any changes to the didactic competencies. And finally, the clinical competencies, and that is the one the board has been discussing. That is the one that we are looking for your ideas as to how we may be able to meet the current clinical competencies, but in perhaps different ways. Again, the clinical competencies are all detailed in the didactic and clinical competency requirements document that you're all familiar with, and of course that's available on ARRT's website. So Within the criteria for possible solutions, possible modifications, again, specific to the clinical competencies, if in fact we were to modify the number of procedures that could be simulated, we would want to do so in such a way that preserves the fidelity of how the procedure would be performed if in fact they were performed on patients, which of course is everyone's preference in terms of seeking true fidelity in the competency. Next slide, please. So, how are we going to identify solutions that meet the criteria that we have set up? One way is webinars such as this. As was mentioned, we've done a number of webinars already with the disciplines. This is the second one that we've done with radiography. As Callie mentioned, it is being recorded. It will be made available to everyone. So we're looking for your input, possible solutions through the webinars. We're looking for your input through the survey, which all program directors received this past Wednesday, and we are looking for that input by next Wednesday when we'll close off the survey. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to review that survey. In fact, we've had over 300 radiography program directors already complete that survey. Excuse me. We are seeking information about your particular program. As I said earlier, we suspect that one solution is not going to address the challenges for all programs. We're looking for specific information for your program regarding the challenges that you are facing, and we'll discuss possible solutions specific to all of those different situations. The survey also asked for your thoughts, your ideas on how you could meet our clinical competencies in an alternative way that still addresses the intent of the competencies. And thirdly, we have email channels that we welcome your possible solutions and questions through. Our preferred avenue is through your program director account online. We realize that some program directors may not have access to that account if they are not able to go to campus and aren't able to access it from home. We've set up a separate email channel, programdirectors@ARRT.org, that if you can't contact us via your program director account, you can use this one as well to provide us with your ideas, potential solutions, your thoughts, and your questions. Next slide, please. Well, that provides the basic context, the framework, and I believe we are ready to take questions that we will distribute among the panelists. Callie, do you have any additional instructions for participants?
Yes, thank you, Jerry. Just as a reminder, we are going to be using the Q&A function during today's webinar. So this will be at the bottom of your computer or mobile screen. You'll see a button to bring up the Q&A window. We see some questions are already starting to come in. So please pay careful attention to the questions that have already been asked, because you can click the thumbs up to vote for a specific question. I will present the most popular questions to our panel, so voting will go further than repeating an existing question. So I will get started. So this is the first question. Is there talk of the ARRT providing a formal statement in support of students returning to clinical settings?
This is Jerry. That's the first time I've heard that suggestion. So I assume basically it is a position statement by ARRT urging facilities to allow students to go back to clinical settings to complete their clinical education. I will put that one before the board.
Thank you. Next question we have is, due to lack of clinical accessibility and reduced availability to PPE, especially for non-healthcare institutions like colleges. Any thoughts on meeting the need to position a person for the clinical competencies?
JJ, Kevin, or Terry? Would you like to take that one?
This is JJ. I think this is a very obviously an issue that many of you are dealing with, and this is one of the reasons we sent out the survey and that type of thing. We are trying to gather information that would help us figure out what works in a majority of facilities and that type of thing. Realizing that not all programs have the same access to equipment, and to kind of go back to what Jerry was saying earlier, we want to make sure that what we come up with ideas but actually help a lot of people, not just like one or two programs that have specific equipment. So please take the opportunity to give us your feedback and your position for your particular program by submitting that survey.
Thank you. The next question we have is, how can I sign the ARRT applications? Will you allow electronic signatures?
Is that a Terry or JJ question? Currently, under current requirements, are electronic signatures allowed?
This is Terry. Currently, we do not have the ability to accept electronic signatures. That's slated for some time in the future. We talk to program directors daily about this question, and they've been very creative in meeting in parking lots, parks, or what have you, in order to transfer the applications, get them signed, and get them mailed.
Thank you, Terry. Next question we have, are there any ways to simulate fluoroscopy studies?
JJ, Terry?
This is JJ. There are ways to simulate those and that type of thing. You'll notice in your requirements there where we talk about simulation and that type of thing. Some of the fluoroscopy procedures are electives and could be simulated. And that type of thing, it's looking at the requirements we have listed there, stay within the confines of that document and things like that. It is potential that you could simulate your fluoro. Obviously, we're not asking you to activate and actually expose anyone, but the other criteria in that could be met, and then you could follow that up with image review of fluoroscopy images to evaluate that component of the procedures.
This is Jerry. Again, the document referenced during my remarks, the primary certification and registration didactic and clinical competency requirements for radiography. Sections 4.1 and 4.2 of that document address performance considerations for the competencies and specifically for radiography, and it talks about the number of procedures that can be simulated, how a simulation would have to occur, and actually includes the list of procedures for example, of the 37 imaging procedures, a maximum of 8 of the mandatory ones can be simulated if it can't be done on a patient. So again, I would encourage you to, if you haven't looked at that document in a little while, to pull that out, review what we say about simulations, how they need to be done, how many can be done, which ones can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are your suggestions for when to mail student applications if we are unsure of the completion dates?
This is Terry. I would say wait a little bit till you have a better idea of what the completion date will be. We accept applications up to 3 months in advance, and we are experiencing the fact that those completion dates are changing. So I think it's best to just hold off for a little bit and see how this plays out.
Thank you, Terry. Our next question is, when will the remainder of the students waiting for ARRT processing of applications be complete?
This is Terry again. As Jerry explained, we are allowed to have very limited staff in the building, and we are doing the best that we can to get those applications processed. And as you know, we are allowed up to 30 days at this time of the year. Every year, it takes us the full 30 days. Right now, we are only about 35 days back. So even with the limited staff, we're doing pretty good. We'll get them as soon as we can, and they are being processed in the order that they are arriving at the building.
Thank you. Our next question is, should a student be involved in an ethics review? Would current circumstances allow for a sequencing accommodation to allow the student to sit for the exam?
That one broke up a little bit for me. Basically, could you repeat it?
Yeah. Should a student be involved in an ethics review? Would current circumstances allow for a sequencing accommodation to allow the student to sit for the exam?
JJ, is that a question for you or Kevin?
This is Kevin. I will take that one. As with any ethics investigation, each one is taken individually. The standards of ethics, the rules of ethics are reviewed to see which may or may not apply in any situation, and then each is investigated on its own merits. So we always take the individual case, regardless of what it is, into consideration when reviewing ethics. If the broader idea is that if, for lack of a better phrase, a corner is cut and the student submits an application, and would ARRT overlook that because, as Jerry said, the ethics requirements are not under consideration for modification. So we would recommend that the students hold those applications until ARRT has released what is acceptable and what is not, so that they can avoid any potential issue. Some ethics investigations can take up to 1.5 years. And while they're in a hurry to get the application completed, submitted, and earn the credential, it could potentially make it much, much longer for them. Even if nothing is found wrong in the situation, it can just take a while. So I would encourage them to hold the application and wait, as opposed to submitting it, even in the small likelihood that they were investigated under an ethics question.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next question is, can the ARRT provide online downloads of the primary applications?
This is Terry. Presently, that is not possible. We are processing the orders of the applications, which you access through the program director's website. We're up to date with those, so they can be ordered anytime.
Thank you, Terry. Our next question is, are you considering increasing the number of simulated mandatory competencies?
This is Jerry. That is one of the potential solutions that the board will consider. Again, one of the things we will gather on the survey is how many competencies are missing for each program, for each student, the average number. Are we close? Are they missing one of the mandatories or 5 of the mandatories? That has been discussed by the board in generalities as to whether or not additional mandatories could be increased or the number could be increased. But one of the things the board didn't want to do is to simply make a decision and increase to a certain number only to find that that doesn't really solve the problems for most programs. So the specificity of how many I can't speak to. The data we get from the survey will help inform that decision, but the potential of increasing the simulations is a possible approach. The modification of the criteria that we currently have is a potential approach. Those will all be on the table for the board to consider and ultimately make a decision as to whether or not the integrity of the credential can be preserved by making modifications to how the requirements are documented.
Thank you, Jerry. Our next question is, if there is a change in who the program director occurring now, will that create any problems for a program?
KJ, take that one.
We actually, if there's a program director change, we just encourage you to call the office and the program director line, and we'll help you work through that process. We'll get the appropriate form sent out, get that information. There does have to be a letter that would come from either like the dean or a higher official at the institution that sponsors the program, but we can work through that with you. So please just call the office and ask us. Specialist.
And Callie,
Yes.
in a related, going back to a question that Terry answered a question or two ago in regards to the applications, we have had some people ask about obtaining the applications because they may not be able to get on campus to receive those. We encourage them to contact us through the program director website or to call the ARRT and discuss that with a call agent, because we can mail applications to their home or another location. We just need to have a conversation with them about that. But we know sometimes they can't make it to campus given the current environment.
Absolutely. Our next question says, to be clear, these modifications are being considered for soon to be graduated students only, correct?
That is correct. We are considering modifications only for students that are quite near graduation. We do understand that the disruption is very likely to continue for an amount of time. We are characterizing any modifications as temporary, but we are not going to say it's only for the next month, the next 3 months, the next 6 months, because obviously things change quite quickly. We certainly have learned that over the last couple of months, how quickly things can change. And it will basically be as temporary as the situation defines itself, as opposed to ARRT saying they'll be temporarily modified for 3 months, for example. We simply can't predict how long modifications will need to be made. So the modifications and who it applies to along the same lines will be kind of a moving target. If a month from now conditions have changed for the worse, let's say, the board may need to consider additional modifications beyond any ones they're thinking about right now. We understand that it's a very fluid situation. It is a longer term situation, but we are focusing on the students who are near graduation, and realize we'll have to kind of do a rolling consideration of modifications.
Thank you. I just want to do a quick time check. We currently have 15 more minutes, so we will work to answer as many questions as we can during this time frame. Our next question is, what is the plan for discussion about the needs of students who are in the middle of their educational program? These students are the ones that will continue to experience issues gaining access to clinical education.
And that kind of relates back to my previous remarks in terms of we understand that this will be an ongoing situation. However, if the last 2 months have taught us anything, it's impossible to predict what will be happening next week, next month, 3 months down the road. So the board will need to continue to consider the modifications and what modifications are appropriate at a particular time. Now, we understand not being able to predict and not knowing certain what's going to happen to my students that are halfway through the program, what's going to happen when they graduate 12 months from now or whatever the time frame is frustrating, it's challenging, but it's really simply the nature of the situation right now. It's really impossible for us to predict what's going to happen to a student that's halfway through their program right now, whether or not conditions will change to the point where they will be allowed into clinical sites to do their competencies, or they still won't be. That's why as we look at modifications, it will be a rolling consideration as to what are the conditions right now. Do we need to continue any modifications? Do we need to revert back to pre-pandemic criteria, or do we need to look for even further modifications? It's
Thank
simply a situation where it's impossible to predict very far out on the horizon.
Thank you. Can OR competencies be simulated?
Terry or JJ?
JJ, I guess I'm gonna answer this from the perspective of if you're talking about the mobile C-arm studies specific, because we don't really have our document broke down into specifics, so I'm not sure if you're talking about cross-table laterals or what type of thing you're talking about there. But from a standpoint of the C-arm procedures, those are listed as mandatory, so they would be part of the mandatory competency simulation requirements. And again, just refer back to your document there of what all that competency needs to include. So we do not restrict OR competencies from simulation. It's just a matter of program director making sure that what is done during that simulation will, how it's competently performed, will transfer to the clinical setting fine.
Thank you. Our next question is, what time frame are you looking at for finalizing modifications?
Well, although I tend to be a person who likes to make predictions, you can only make predictions when you have a period of experience that you can count on. And right now, we really don't, because things change so quickly. What I will say is that once we close off the input next Wednesday, we will immediately start the tabulation of that information. The board will be talking about that in terms of helping it inform their discussions. The board doesn't wait for in-person meetings to discuss that. They have a number of tools, including an online discussion forum that they use every week. There are issues that we put before the board that they are discussing and deciding. They have online meetings. We just had one last week. Those will continue. So it really is a continuous deliberative process that they have. That information will be fed into it. As I noted earlier, there's a number of stakeholders that need to be brought into the loop based upon proposed solutions, including the licensing states, including the accreditation, the credentialing accreditation bodies. So all I can say is that the board will act on it as quickly as they can, given the various audiences that we need to bring into those discussions.
Thank you. Seeing that we may be practicing social distancing for 1 to 2 years, any consideration for virtual clinicals / performing those comps that can be simulated using a virtual lab?
This is JJ. Those are definitely alternatives that we're looking into. We're looking not only from a virtual perspective of simulators and that type of thing, as well as looking at video and different options like that. So those are all things that have been suggested that the board will be taking into consideration.
And again, the format is the possible formats that you could use in your particular program is one of the areas covered in the survey. We're looking for, again, we don't want to say, here's the solution, only to find out that programs have other solutions that might be carry more fidelity to actually performing the procedure with the patient. So again, if you haven't already sent in your survey results, please respond to those questions and get those as input for the board's deliberations.
Thank you. Our next question is, will you consider modifications for geriatric specific competencies?
Again, those are kind of getting down to the specifics on individual procedures and things like that is something that the board's going to have to take a look at. But I think pointing out that specific age group and those competencies listed under there for geriatric or physically or cognitively impaired and that type of thing related to aging is a good thing that we'll definitely take into consideration.
And looks like we only have time for a few more questions. So our next question is, how many elective exams can be simulated?
Right now, within the radiography, didactic, and clinical competency requirements, section 422 for the imaging procedures specifically, 15 of the 34 elective procedures must be selected, and we do allow those to be simulated if they can't be demonstrated on patients. So again, I would direct your attention to that particular document. Those are our current requirements, and we have not at this point made any modifications to those requirements. They are the ones that currently exist. We recognize that they may be modified based upon the input from the survey, but right now, the number that may be simulated are as stated in the didactic and clinical competency requirements document.
Thank you. And here's our next question. I understand your explanation of rolling considerations. However, can there be some end of timeline to provide us to have some kind of communication?
What we will do is communicate our progress, give more frequent updates via the website. I think one of the challenges, again, part of the reason for providing the context within which we've been working over the last 8 weeks is to illustrate, just like you, things have changed quickly. We've had to adapt to them, keeping essential operations going. And with those challenges, I think there's information in terms of updates that we just weren't able to get out onto the website because we were, quite frankly, occupied with very immediate challenges in terms of transitioning staff and complying with various state restrictions that presented themselves to us. So what we can commit to is doing our absolute best to providing more information as to the status of the deliberations. We really just can't predict when will we have an answer to what sort of modifications we'll make.
Thank you. Our next question says, my state, like yours, has recommended a stay-at-home directive. With current on-campus and clinical restrictions in place, has the ARRT given thought to the need for another person simulated clinical competencies for soon-to-be graduating students?
this is JJ. Yes, as we mentioned earlier on this question, we are looking at virtual competency simulation, things like that. So how we break that down as, are we talking virtual competency or simulation, that type of thing, all of those things are being looked at.
Thank you. Our next question says, would you consider using a program like Adobe Sign to handle the completion of the exam application?
This is Jerry. Within our scheduled projects, one of them was to bring the primary eligibility pathway applications, radiography application, for example, online. Because of other priorities, that wasn't started yet, but we are meeting on a weekly basis, looking at our priorities for various projects, including online application, and we are looking at which ones really need to be reprioritized based upon the current situation. So will that be something considered? Yes, it will. Again, currently we are living within the requirements as they are right now, including how the applications are handled, but that is something we're actively looking at reprioritizing based upon the pandemic, the conditions created by pandemic, for moving some of the projects around and reprioritizing and perhaps getting those done more quickly than seemed appropriate pre-pandemic.
Thank you, Jerry. We currently have time for 2 more questions. So our next one says, would the ARRT accept student simulations for lab courses using the ASRT Ziltron or SIM TICS?
As we've mentioned, we're looking at all different types of opportunities and things like that for simulation. We can certainly take that into consideration as well.
Thank you. And I will answer, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a good example of there are probably going to be multiple solutions because one solution won't really work for all programs. So I think there will be multiple things the board looks at and considers as a potential approach for some of the programs, and then multiple approaches to kind of address all of the different programs.
Thank you, Jerry. And I will go ahead and answer our last question in my closing remarks here. Thank you to everyone for participating, and thank you to our panelists. Either later today or early next week, we will be sending a link of the recording to all who are invited to this webinar. We will also post the webinar to ARRT's COVID-19 update page, which you can access by visiting the ARRT website at arrt.org. Thank you to all of you for joining us today and for your service.
And I will just add, this is Jerry. Thank you. We do appreciate your support. We do understand the challenges you're facing. We are working to try to address those, and best of luck and stay well.